Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. With COVID cases rising sharply in Europe and East Asia, we ask today, could something similar happen in India, or is that unlikely? That's the key issue I shall explore today with Professor of Virology at Ashoka University and a Senior Research Fellow at Green Templeton College at the University of Oxford, Shahid Jameel. Professor Jameel, let's start with the recent fairly sharp rise in cases in Europe and East Asia. And many people fear something similar could happen in America. Not a few days ago, cases in UK were rising by almost 1 lakh a day. In Germany, they were rising by almost 3 lakhs a day. In South Korea, they actually crossed 6 lakhs a day. So to begin with, how worrying is this situation?
Well, let's look at the numbers first, Karan. At this time, UK is pulling about 60,000 cases a day. It went up to about 90,000 a day or so. Across Europe, if you take Europe as a whole, at this point, it's almost 3 lakh cases per day. Major contributions coming from Germany, around 220,000, Austria, and Netherlands, each around 45 to 50,000 a day. But if you look at the severe cases and mortality, that is still below 0.1%. The same is with UK. UK is at this point pulling roughly 25,000 cases. It's down now from the numbers we quoted earlier. So the point is that yes, cases have gone up. In America, the same. Cases have gone up, but the death rate has been kept down, and that's largely because of vaccinations. Now, coming to whether this is worrying for India or if it is worrying in general, I would still worry about it for two reasons. Any infection, any COVID infection is worrying for two reasons. The first reason is long COVID. We know that about 1/3 of people who get infected show symptoms of long COVID, and this includes people who have mild infection. We don't fully understand the long-term consequences of long COVID. And the second point is, the more opportunity you give for the virus to spread through infection, the more opportunity you give it to mutate. And which way the virus will go is still not predictable.
Let me go back in your answer and first talk to you about the situation in Europe and East Asia. As you say, right, there was a time when the numbers were growing at just under 1 lakh for UK, just under 3 lakhs for Germany. Now it's come down, it's not growing at that level. But the important thing you said is the mortality rate, both in Europe and in UK, is around 0.1%. That's a fraction.
Yes, that's like seasonal flu.
So the mortality rate at the moment of 0.1% is like seasonal flu.
That's sort of like seasonal flu, yes.
So this particular surge, yes, may be very infectious, numbers may be going up, and in terms of numbers it may be disconcerting, but in terms of illness and mortality, it's no more than seasonal flu.
Absolutely right. That's what the facts are. Yes.
So then let me ask you this. It's widely believed that the surges in both East Asia and in Europe are now the responsibility of the Omicron variant BA2. What do we know about BA2, both in terms of its infectiousness and in terms of the virulence of the disease it causes?
Right. So if you recall, Omicron started replacing the Delta variant somewhere around December of last year. And what we in general call Omicron is the sublineage BA.1. But Omicron has multiple lineages now, and the three main lineages are BA1, BA1.1, and BA2. In the past few weeks, BA2 has been increasing. And at this particular time, if you look at the global scenario, roughly 57% of infections are from BA2, 42% are from BA1, and about 1% is Delta globally. Of course, this is the global average. Different countries may vary. So that's point number one.
Just to interrupt, Delta therefore is almost disappearing.
Almost disappeared. Delta has almost disappeared.
Please carry on.
Yeah. Now, BA2 varies from BA1 in its genetic sequence, but it's still close enough to be in the same Omicron lineage. There are 23 unique mutations if you compare BA1 and BA2 head to head. Out of these 23 unique mutations, 8 are unique to BA2 and 13, so sorry, it's 21, and 13 are unique to BA1. Now, as a result of these unique mutations, what we know at this time is that BA2 is more transmissible than BA1. There are 3 or 4 studies that support this. So, for example, there is a study from Denmark which shows that people who are infected with BA2 transmit the virus much better in a household setting. There's another study from England which shows that BA2 has accelerated the rise in cases. There is a third study from Hong Kong, and you know that Hong Kong recently had a huge surge which showed that again BA2 was responsible for it, and at one time the doubling rate in Hong Kong was 1.28 days. So this is how much more transmissible.
Do we have a
BA2
percentage
is.
figure to determine how much more transmissible BA2 is compared to BA1? Can one say it's 50% more, 60% more?
I have not seen that number, but it's certainly significantly more transmissible than BA1.
What about the virulence of the disease?
Right. So virulence, there was one disturbing study that came from Japan, which was a study in animals, in hamsters to be exact. They used unvaccinated hamsters and gave them BA1 or BA2. And it turned out that BA2 was more virulent, gave more serious disease. But mind you, these were unvaccinated animals. Studies from human populations in multiple countries, and remember, humans have been exposed to the virus, humans have been vaccinated. So these studies from humans show that there is no difference between the virulence of BA2 and BA1.
And is this corroborated by the pressure on hospitals in Europe and England?
Yeah, absolutely it is. So that's the basis for this
So
statement.
the picture about BA2 is the following. It's considerably more infectious than BA1, but we don't have a percentage of how much more infectious it is. There is a hamster study that suggests that it's virulent, but that was done with unvaccinated hamsters. But if you look at real world data, and if you look at the impact on hospitalization both in the UK and Europe, then in fact the virulence of the disease is no greater than BA1.
Right.
And as you said, the mortality rate is 0.1%, which is identical to the seasonal flu mortality rate, and no one worries about the seasonal flu mortality rate anywhere.
Exactly.
Against this background, let's come to the situation in India. Now, unlike Europe and the UK, cases in India at the moment are steadily coming down. I believe as of this morning, the daily increase is just around 1,540. The positivity rate has fallen below 0.5%. All of that's very reassuring. But when you look at the history of the last 3 waves in India, I noticed that the Indian trajectory was always about 3-4 weeks behind the European trajectory. So is there a possibility that 4 weeks from now, history will repeat itself and we will see in India what UK and Europe are experiencing today?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question. Hindsight is always 20/20. But let me put some facts on the table and let me argue with facts. India certainly has the lowest number of daily cases coming in now than we have, remembered in a long time. In fact, this low we were almost 2 years ago, in early May 2020. So we are at the lowest point of the pandemic in a very, very long time. And that's really good news. But before I answer your question, let me tell you about two studies that came out in the last week. One is a study from the Beth Israel Medical Center in Boston, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last week. And the other is a very large study that has come from Qatar, which has been uploaded as a preprint, so it is not yet peer reviewed. The first study, they took 24 vaccinated people who had received 2 doses of the RNA vaccine and a booster, and they took 8 people who had prior infection and saw whether they can get infected or not. Now, in the first group, and they looked at BA1 and BA2. The result of this study was that while BA2 was more transmissible, but even when people, when people were already infected, and these infections usually happened in the time when BA1 was really high, they were protected. So what does it, so this study basically told us, again, that BA2 is more transmissible than BA1, and that if you have had prior infection with BA1, you are protected from BA2. Okay. The second study, the Qatar study, is a very interesting study. It was for a period of 2 years, used almost 800,000 people, data from 800,000 people, both vaccinated as well as people who got infected. And again, the summary of that study is a little different from what we have been seeing so far. And this study says that if you got infected with any strain, including Delta, you are better protected from Omicron and further infections. Also,
can I just, this is very important. If you've had a prior infection,
whether it's alpha, beta, gamma, delta, whatever,
this protects you from Omicron. And when you say Omicron, that includes its lineages BA1, BA2, both.
Yes, yes. So that's what it showed. And it also showed that infection gives you better protection than vaccination.
And what about the combination of both?
Well, they couldn't really analyze the combination of both in this study. So intuitively, one would believe that a combination of both would offer better protection. So now that we have in India a lot of people who have been vaccinated, a lot of people who have been exposed, I would think that we should be all right in India in the coming days.
Let's explore this a little further. First, in terms of vaccination, I gather something like 95% of the total eligible population.
Right.
Which technically goes down to 12 as of today, but I assume these figures actually refer to the period when it went down to only 15. So 95% of people over 15 have had one jab, and pretty close to 81% of people over 15 have had 2 jabs. And I'm not including people over 60 who got boosters. So in terms of vaccination, India is very well covered.
Yes.
Secondly, in terms of seropositivity, we had a devastating Delta wave in the summer of last year, something the likes of which the world hadn't seen till then.
Yes.
And on top of that, we've had an Omicron wave in December, January, and February this year. So I imagine the combination of the two have also given India very high levels of seropositivity. Does this mean that the combination of India's high vaccination and high seropositivity means, as a people, Indians are reasonably well protected?
I would think so. And you're absolutely right, there are high levels of seropositivity. Remember the ICMR 4th Sero Survey, which happened in July 2021, which said that 67% seropositivity. Now, 67% of the population is about 930 million people. Since then, we've had the Omicron wave. So at this point, India has about 43 million confirmed cases. At the end of the Delta wave, we had about 35 million confirmed cases. So if you scale up based on that, my estimate is that about 1.1 to 1.2 billion people in India have antibodies to the virus.
That's pretty close to 92, 93% because the population is 1.38 billion.
Absolutely. So whether these antibodies have come from vaccination or infection or a combination of both, we don't know how much is the contribution of what, but that's
But the combined picture of vaccination and seropositivity suggests we're pretty well protected.
Pretty well protected. But we also know that protection from vaccination, antibody-based protection goes down in time.
I'll come to that because that leads us into boosters. But first, let me ask you this. We're pretty well protected because of vaccination and seropositivity.
Right.
But are we better protected than Europe? Because I imagine vaccination levels in Europe, if anything, would be better than ours. And their seropositivity can't be much worse than ours because although they didn't have a Delta-like second wave that we had in summer, but they've had multiple waves. So are we better protected than Europe? Because I suppose that is one reason why if we are better protected, we won't suffer the same experience they're going through.
Well, I would hate to compare across populations to say that we are better protected than them or they are better protected than us, for the simple reason that Europe and India have deployed very different vaccines. And we know that, in challenge with new variants, some vaccines are behaving better than others. Some vaccines are giving better T-cell responses than others. Further, genetic differences between populations complicate this. Europe has completely done away with mask mandates and even the legal requirements to report and self-isolate if you are positive. Now that will have a bearing on cases going up, and what you are seeing in Europe is that. So I would say that India is fairly well protected, but whether it is better than Europe or worse than Europe, I would not put my finger on it.
But you also made a very important point. It's invidious to compare between two populations and two countries in terms of who's better protected, but India is very well protected.
Yes.
But the other thing is, one of the reasons why cases are going up very sharply in Europe, or maybe 2-3 days ago they're not going up as sharply today, is because Europe, England in particular, have done away with mask mandates.
Yes.
They've even done away with isolation and compulsory reporting, which means there will be surges that look greater there than here because we still have mask mandates and we still have, presumably, compulsory reporting. With that then in the background, let's come to this issue of the waning immunity both from infection and from vaccination, because that raises the question, do we need more boosters? At the moment, because of a change made in the policy last week, boosters are available to not just frontline workers and health workers, but everyone over the age of 60. But if there is a potential, and maybe it's only a potential wave lurking across the horizon, should we now give boosters to every adult?
Yeah, so I think by way of policy, India has to decide what it is going to be content with. Are we going to be content with very little disease despite rising cases like Europe, or are we going to worry about cases also? So by way of policy, we have to be very clear and clearly communicate it.
And that clarity doesn't exist.
That clarity, at least I have not seen, and I really don't think that it exists yet. My thinking on boosters has been very clear and consistent throughout this. If you have a tool available that works, you deploy it. There appears to be no dearth of vaccines in India at this point. India is also at the lowest point of the pandemic. This is the time to be aggressive and wipe it out as much as we can. Because remember, we are also opening up. We are opening up the economy, we are opening up society, schools are opening, everything is happening. In the context of schools, it's very clear that children get infected in a home setting, and if both parents are fully vaccinated, the risk of a child getting infected at home falls drastically. This was a paper in Science last week, actually, again, a study coming from Israel. Also, when schools are opening up, do you have teachers that are fully vaccinated and boosted? If you do all that, then children are better protected, which is a population where vaccines haven't reached as much as it has in adults. So I think our priority should be to get as many 2 doses in adults 18 plus as we can. Whoever has 1 dose should get a 2nd dose. And also, immunity from boosters, antibodies from vaccination wanes with time. We know that. This is global data, multiple sources of data. Since we have vaccines, why not use them to boost adults? Let me argue about the current policy that the vaccine is available to everyone above 60. What about a 50-year-old who has cardiovascular problems? Would he or she not be given a booster? Why not? That person is more susceptible to serious disease than a 61-year-old healthy person.
But if I understood the first part of your answer, what you're saying is if you've got the vaccines, and in addition you know that the immunity from vaccination, even after a 2nd jab, wanes within 5-6 months.
Yes.
Then if you want to stop cases and you want to absolutely guard against serious disease, every adult over 18 should be vaccinated.
Yes.
So I'm just repeating because it's very important. You believe every adult over 18 should be vaccinated with a booster?
Yes. But the priority has to be get as many adults 2 doses first.
But that we already know is very high. 81% of everyone over 15, not 18 now, 15 has had 2 doses.
Yeah.
95% have had 1. And we all know that the last mile is always the most difficult to cover.
It is.
Surely now the priority should be to follow a twin track approach. Do everything to ensure that that remaining 18-19% who haven't had a 2nd jab get it,
Yes.
but also make sure everyone else over 18 gets a booster.
Yeah, I think boosters should be just made available to all adults who are willing to take them. Remember, our vaccination policy is still optional. You know, nobody is forcing you to go take a vaccine.
Every adult who wants a booster should be able to get it,
Yes.
full stop.
Yes.
There should be no conditions in terms of age
Right.
or comorbidity. Everyone over 18 is entitled to a
I
booster.
say this for 2 reasons, Karan. One is, that vaccines are now available in plenty in the country. There are 9 vaccines that are approved. There are 5 vaccines that are made in the country, but we are only deploying mainly 2 vaccines. We have much more in our kitty than we can give.
And you're pointing out an essential illogicality in the government's position. We have no dearth of vaccines, both in terms of quantity and in terms of the number of vaccines.
Right.
Secondly, we know that immunity wanes after 5-6 months. A lot of people's immunity, therefore, will have waned. And we know that if you give them a booster, you will boost their protection against serious illness.
Yes.
And it also has the impacts that you've just described in terms of children in schools. And therefore, from a logical point of view and from the availability of vaccines point of view, every adult should be given a vaccine if he or she wants one. And when I say vaccine, I mean a booster.
Absolutely. And my second point along that train of thought is that COVID, so far whatever we have seen, is complex. There are too many twists and turns along the way. The policy to combat COVID cannot be equally complex. Otherwise, things go haywire.
You need a simple policy.
We need a simple policy to act on a complex problem.
And the simplest policy is every adult over 18 can have a booster.
Exactly.
And this is where the point you made about long COVID comes in. Because the government's thinking is that they have already protected people against serious illness, although we know that the level of protection against serious illness after several months have passed also begins to wane. It doesn't remain at the same high level as it would be after the second jab.
Yes.
But the government's thinking is if people are only going to get mild infections, they'll recover quickly and you don't need to boost them. You're saying even people with mild infections can end up with long COVID.
Which we don't understand fully.
And long COVID can be debilitating. It also puts a strain on the health system.
Exactly.
So another risk, if one risk of not giving boosters is you're allowing immunity against serious illness to come down. It may not come down hugely, but it does come down and therefore it endangers people.
Right.
The other risk is that even if people get mild infections, which they bounce out of 3 or 5 days later, they could still end up with long COVID. Something like 30% of people with mild infections get long COVID, and long COVID we don't understand.
We don't understand.
So there's a very clear medical case, logical case, and even a case in terms of the availability of vaccines.
Yes, absolutely. And India has done so well in its vaccination program. We need to be aggressive.
So then can I ask you this?
Yeah.
Given the very convincing arguments you've delivered, would it not be irresponsible not to make boosters available to every adult over 18 who wants one?
Well, I mean, by way of public policy, we have to decide what we are willing to accept.
But if you are deliberately accepting a higher risk of serious illness and a risk of people ending up with long COVID, when the vaccines are available and they're made here,
yes,
then what you're accepting is something that's irresponsible. You shouldn't be accepting this.
we should not be accepted.
So will you use the word it's irresponsible not
Well,
to give
I
boosters?
would not use a strong word like irresponsible, because I
How
think
about it's inexplicable that boosters aren't being given?
I would say that our vaccination policy has had its
Irrational not to give boosters?
ups and downs.
Is it irrational not to give boosters in these circumstances?
I would say that it doesn't support the scientific evidence that we have at this time.
Unscientific not to give boosters?
Yes.
Unscientific?
Unscientific.
Okay. Let's then come to the connected question. What vaccines should be used for boosters? At the moment, India gives a third of the same. But studies done by the University of Southampton, and I believe those studies came out in September last year, clearly show that better than a third AstraZeneca or Covishield is Novavax, which we call Covovax, and it's made in India.
Yes.
Yet we're not giving Novavax or Covovax. We're insisting that people who've had Covishield should have a third Covishield. And separately, newspaper reports of a study done by the Christian Medical College in Vellore. It hasn't been officially released, but the newspaper reports are out and CMC hasn't denied the reports, suggest that Covishield is a better booster than Covaxin, and yet people who've had 2 jabs of Covaxin don't have the choice of getting Covishield, they have to stick to Covaxin. So is there a case here where despite the availability of more and better vaccines, we're using less optimum vaccines for boosters?
Yeah, so the study that you refer to, the Southampton study, is also called the COVID booster study. And in that study, they took people who had received 2 jabs of either the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine, and then gave them either the same vaccine as a third dose or 7 different vaccines as the third dose, and then looked at neutralizing antibodies, looked at T cells. And the summary of that study is that if you've had 2 jabs of RNA vaccine, the third jab of RNA vaccine gives you the best response. If you've had 2 jabs of the AstraZeneca vaccine, a third jab of the RNA vaccine gives you the best response. But if you don't have RNA vaccine available, then the next best response comes from the Novavax protein vaccine,
Which we call Covovax.
which we call Covovax. And in fact, even a half dose of the Novavax vaccine gives better response than a full third dose of the AstraZeneca
This
vaccine.
is very important. I want to repeat it. A half dose of Novavax as a booster
Right.
after 2 AstraZenecas gives a better response than a full AstraZeneca.
Right. That's what that study shows. Now, India's booster policy has been to use homologous boosters, which means that if you have had 2 jabs of Covishield, you'll get a third jab of Covishield. If you've had 2 jabs of Covaxin, you'll have another jab of Covaxin. You know, there is no data available on this strategy. The first study that started after DCGI's approval of the study was the Christian Medical College Vellore study that you referred to. And I have seen unsubstantiated reports in the media of parts of that study.
But not denied either by CMC or the government.
Yeah, so I don't know the numbers. So what that study shows and what I have seen in the press is that if after 2 doses of Covaxin, you give a third dose of Covishield, you get a 6-fold rise in titer. That's all I know about that study. Nothing else has come out. Now 6-fold could be 1 going to 6, or it can be 100 going to 600. So, the difference between 1 and 100 is very substantial, and so is the difference between 6 and 600.
But that same report, it was in the Indian Express, said that Covishield as a booster after Covaxin leads to a 6-fold rise in antibodies.
Right.
But if you gave a third Covaxin after 2 earlier Covaxins, the rise is only 2 times.
Yeah.
So clearly, even though we don't know the magnitude,
so clearly from
Covishield is a better booster.
From whatever we have seen from the CMC study, I would say heterologous boost is a better approach for people who have taken either Covaxin or Covishield.
And to translate that into simple language,
A different vaccine.
A different vaccine, which means after 2 Covaxins, Covishield is better.
Right.
Now this is very interesting because the conclusion that will be forming in people's minds is the question, are we in India following what science all over the world is already telling us? You pointed out that in terms of the need to give boosters, science has pointed out that immunity wanes after 5-6 months. Science has pointed out that it keeps children and households and schools better protected. Science has pointed out that even if you get mild infections, which seems to be something the government in India is prepared to risk, you can still end up with long COVID, and 30% have it. Now that's one lot of science that would determine the need to give boosters, and you've already agreed it's unscientific not to be giving boosters. But now there's another lot of science that seems to be also not looked at in India. The fact that the University of Southampton has established that Covovax or Novavax is a better booster than another AstraZeneca, or that the CMC is suggesting, we don't have the full details, that Covishield is better as a booster than Covaxin. Why is all this science not being used by the people who make decisions? It's sitting there, it's available, but they don't seem to be using it.
I cannot answer that question. I'm not part of the team that makes the decision.
But are you perplexed by this?
I am perplexed by this, and I've written about it, that if evidence is available, if data is available globally, we need to use it. Let's not get into this mode that Indians are somehow special or exclusive. We're not. We're just as vulnerable to this disease as anybody else anywhere else. Time and again we have seen this. So if evidence is available somewhere and you have the vaccines available with you, it makes very little sense not to use them.
So in addition to our attitude to boosters being unscientific, our attitude to the science that's available, which is not reflecting in our decision, is perplexing.
It is. I'm confused about the approach.
Can it at all be possible, and I won't name names, but can it at all be possible that the people who make these decisions are not aware of the science, that they haven't got time to read the papers?
I doubt it very much. I mean, they're all smart people and they're all very competent individuals who sit on these committees.
So they're deliberately turning a blind eye, or they're reading and not implementing what they're finding out?
Maybe there are logistics issues that are visible to them but not visible to you and I. I don't know. I can't answer that. But all I'm saying is that the approach that is being followed for boosters is an unscientific approach at this point.
And you're also perplexed by the fact that the science that's available internationally, and some of it available in our own country.
Yes.
I mean, the CMC details must be available to the government even if they're not in the press.
Well, CMC results have just come out, so
but they're not being reflected in the thinking.
Well, it remains to be seen whether policy will change now that those results are available.
That's the other thing.
Government.
Policy takes an awful lot of time to change. One of the changes that's happened in the last 48 hours is that the government has decided to reduce the gap between 2 jabs of Covishield. It used to be 12-16 weeks. It's now been reduced to 8-16. First of all, how meaningful is the reduction from 12-16 to 8-16? Because 8-16 still has the same upper end of 16. So, is it a meaningful way of signaling that you've changed the gap?
Well, I think what it will do is people who have had one jab will get another jab in lesser time now. So it's a good move.
But they have almost double the amount of period to take the second jab. I mean, 8 to 16 is as long as 1 to 8.
So the window period has increased, but the time to the second jab has decreased. And on balance, I think it's still.
But wouldn't it have been clearer for the government to say 12-16 is now being reduced to 8-12?
Possibly. But it's a good move to reduce it down to 8.
And again, if I recall our earlier conversations, this again is something that Britain did 5-6 months ago. And the science was suggesting we should have been doing it as well, but we didn't. In fact, the funny thing is, as Britain went from 10 down to 8, or maybe it was 12 down to 8, we used that precise moment to go from 8 to 16.
Yes, and at that point also, if you recall, I had argued that the dose interval should be less.
Absolutely, because the science was suggesting something else. And this is another example of either we don't follow science or we go off on a tangent of our own. My last question. Are you a little concerned at the way we've been handling boosters, the gap between jabs, and this whole attitude to science? Are you a bit concerned?
Well, let me go back to my earlier answer that if COVID is complex, keep your policies simple to deal with it.
Our policies have been complex and complicated.
Our policies have been equally complex. At any given point, if you ask a man on the street about our vaccination policy, why a man on the street, even several other people would be confused.
In other words, keep it simple so people can understand.
Yes.
If you make it complicated, not only will they not be able to follow it, but they'll probably actually be disinterested in doing so as well.
Yes.
Finally, beyond immediately giving boosters to every adult, what other advice would you give the Indian people so that complacency or carelessness doesn't lead to India ending up in the same situation Europe and East Asia face today?
Well, the virus is mutating. We also know that antibody levels go down with time. So India will at some point see some spikes in cases. I wouldn't call it a wave. Media in India at this point is fixated on a fourth wave. I really don't know what you will call a wave, but there will be surges, but they will be localized. It will not be like the whole country will erupt at any given point. But be prepared to see surges in infections as we go along.
And you're also saying be careful about the language you use to describe those surges.
Yes.
Because the wrong word could create panic when it's not necessary or justified.
Yes. So, I think the media is working in binaries. Either there is a wave or there is no wave. It won't be like that. There will be localized surges and we need to be prepared for that. The more we vaccinate people, the more we allow people to get boosters because vaccines are available, we are going to restrict that. So by way of policy, we should do that. For individuals, your best option is to firstly get fully vaccinated. If a booster is available, go take a booster. And secondly, while you may be seeing people in London and New York running around without masks, in Delhi and Bombay, please don't do that. Wear a mask in crowded places and certainly indoors if you are in the company of people whose whereabouts you don't know.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Jameel. That's very clear. We need to be cautious, we need to wear masks, but more importantly, the media should also be very careful about the language it uses, because when you have localized small spikes and surges, don't start describing them as waves. It creates the wrong impression. It needlessly creates panic.
Yes.
One last question. Is there any assurance that because Omicron was less serious than Delta, but perhaps more infectious, that the next mutation will be perhaps more infectious but less virulent? Do they, in other words, follow a trajectory of each mutation being more infectious but less worrying? Or can we have a reverse whereby the next mutation becomes more worrying and more infectious?
It all depends on the mutation. So there are examples of mutations coming in later in other viruses, especially in animal populations, which have become more virulent. We are going by what we have seen in pandemic flu, for example, respiratory viruses, and there the subsequent variants have reduced virulence, perhaps because people have already been infected, people have been vaccinated, and therefore their immune system is better able to resist. But the immune system can also drive certain mutations, and therefore we have to wipe out these viruses as quickly as possible when we get infected. And then the only way that will happen is if our vaccine mediated protection is good.
And so there's no assurance that the next mutation will be milder than the present one. It could actually get worse.
It could.
This is a reason to be vaccinated, boosted, and careful.
Absolutely.
And this is another reason why not boosting every adult allows for mutations to happen, and you're not sure what sort of mutation will be. That's another risk inherent in not boosting every adult.
Especially adults who are in some way immunocompromised, because the virus can take much longer to clear in that person.
And mutate into something worse.
Further in that
That's
person.
another risk the Indian government is running by not immediately boosting every adult.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Jameel.
Thank you, Karan.